we moved to New York City in 1998 to reach people groups. When I say people group, these are ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups of people that are called unreached people groups. And they're called unreached people groups because the percentage of people in that people group who know Jesus is so small that they need outside help to bring the gospel to them. So we were focusing on taking the gospel to unreached people groups. And alongside of this ministry, we had churches and other mission organizations started to come to us and say, hey, can you train our people in ministry? And so probably about 15 years ago, we started a training program. We have 1-week training programs, 2-month, and then we have a whole 1-year training program on how to engage people spiritually and to make disciples. So a lot of the content from that training, or at least a lot of the principles, I should say, are in this book. Today we're going to look at like some of the ideas in maybe 2 or 3 of the chapters of the book. So if you feel like you really need to grow in this area, the book, you can scan it right there to buy it. And if you're sitting here, you're thinking, scan it? How do I scan that? Like, what does that even mean? We have books over here, so for you to buy with actually paper. There's these paper money you can actually use right there. Okay. In Habakkuk, the book of Habakkuk, in 2:14, it says this. It says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The earth will be filled. Now, let me just say that this is a prophecy, and that will happen. It will happen. That's part of God's plan. That's God's plan, actually, from Genesis chapter 1, that was his plan. In Genesis chapter 1, he said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 9, 6 through 9, you see the flood happen, and then he says to Noah's family in chapter 9, he says, now, we had a corrective, we needed to have a corrective here, but now be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. God's plan is to fill the earth with his glory, but he is calling us, his plan in order to do that is through us as we go out. As Dave said this morning, as we are his body, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you out to fill the earth. And he has given us what is called the Great Commission. We think of Matthew 28 as the Great Commission. Actually, there's a number of different Great Commission passages. John 20, like I said, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. Acts, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses, and so forth. So there's a number of Great Commission passages that we as believers are called to be a part of to see the earth filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. And that's going to come through the proclamation and the sharing and the witnessing to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But can somebody read this out loud for us? Or maybe, is that going to mess things up with the recording? Should I just, is that good? Somebody read this out loud, Matthew 28. Oh, I didn't say Matthew 28, but it is Matthew 28, 18 through 20. The Great Commission. Please. Terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, now, I want you to call it out, and then I will repeat it. What are some major ideas we see in this passage? Jesus has authority, and what he says with authority to say it, and we are called to respond. So Jesus has authority. Thank you. What else? Go. Go. Oh, this is a big one. This is a big one. I'll tell you what. I've been doing ministry now for officially in New York City for 26 years, and we've seen many people come to faith. Every person that I have seen come to faith, it's because I had to go and pursue, and our workers had to pursue. I mean, God does all kinds of things. it's not very common that someone out of the blue comes up to me and says, hey, what must I do to be saved? 99.9% of the time, I'm going. So yes, we are called to go. Good, what else? Teach them. Actually, teach them what? Teach them to know everything I have commanded you? Teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. Good. Anything else? What's that? I am with you always until the end of the age. I am with you always. And just say it, some people say, well, wasn't this command, this commission just given to the apostles? No, because it's to the end of the age. So this is carried on until the end of the age through his body, through his disciples. Okay? But the important thing for you to realize is that the mission that you are here to learn about and see move forward, Jesus is with you. Jesus is with you. You are not alone as you go out. You are not alone as you grow in this area of being a witness. And Jesus is with you. He's with you if it goes well, and he's with you if it doesn't. Do you know what I mean? He's with you if they respond positively, and he's with you if they don't respond positively. So it's important to know that, and that you, as you go out, are being the aroma of Christ. To some, it's the aroma of life, and to others, it's the aroma of death. And you know what? Sometimes if you're the aroma of death to some people, they don't like you. And Jesus is with you, even in that. All right. So, let me ask some questions, then they're here on our sheet. What images come to mind for you when you hear the word evangelism? And call it out and I'll repeat it. Or I'll just repeat it. Yes. Billy Graham Crusades, okay? That you have this highly orchestrated event where there's advertising and marketing, and you have this superhero Christian in the front who gives a message, and that's how people come to Jesus. That's one view, or as Pastor said, this stereotype of evangelism. Good, thank you. What else? Share. What do you mean? Yeah, so that's another, that we are actually sharing the good news. Good, and we're going to share this, and we're going to unpack that even more. Good, what else? Street preachers. Someone on the corner, and they might be very polished and very good, or they might be saying, and you're going to go to hell if you don't believe right now, and God damn will damn you, and blah, blah, blah. And we have this image. How'd I do with that? Is that pretty good? Okay, good. So we have this image, this stereotype of a preacher, that maybe a fire and brimstone type preacher. Good.
Programs like Evangelism Explosion or Alpha or things like that.
Okay, programs like Evangelism Explosion or Alpha. And let me just say something about programs, and I'm probably jumping the gun a little bit here. I think evangelism training on how to systematically and logically think through sharing the gospel is really valuable. That's really valuable. The problem with most evangelism training is not the content, it's how do we get there? I mean, how does it ever happen where I get into a conversation with somebody naturally where I can actually go through and just share some of these things that I know? And most of us, that's the bottleneck, is that we have a hard time just engaging people and having natural spiritual conversations to even get there. So, yes, good. Anybody else have a concept in their mind of evangelism? Yes. Okay, self-righteousness. Arrogance, self-righteous. We even said this, maybe they're obnoxious. Okay? But just this arrogant self-righteousness. I'll tell you, you know what I hate about most evangelism along those lines? Is that we make it sound like following Jesus is always wonderful. Oh, yeah, and then I accepted Jesus, and I've had joy ever since. I feel like saying, no, you haven't. Liar. Liar. I tell people, we're going to talk about this whole thing about turning up your spiritual volume, but I tell people, look, if you're going into work and people are like, oh, how are you today? I'm not doing good, to be honest with you. You're having lunch with a colleague. Well, why not? I don't know, I feel like when I pray, God doesn't hear me. I feel like I'm speaking to a wall. You would say that? Half the Psalms say that. Lord, where are you? Why are you silent? I can tell you this, that if you engage somebody with this self-arrogant, everything is always perfect mentality, they will not connect. But if you go to someone and say, I feel like when I pray, God doesn't hear me, you know what they're going to say? So do I. I've been praying for my mother for years, and I just feel like God doesn't hear me. Like, that's when they'll connect, when we're just honest and real. There's this pastor on my street in Harlem, and every time I see him, I say, hey, pastor, how you doing? He says, too blessed to be stressed. That's not true. And then he says, blessed by the best, you know. But that's not true. We use these cliche statements, and we come off as arrogant, distant, and not genuine. And that's just the wrong path. And basically, if you get anything else from this morning, I hope that you get, hey, it's okay to just be honest about where I am, naturally. Okay? Good. All right, let's see what else. Tell me some negative feelings that you have around evangelism. We kind of talked about them already, but tell me some feelings that come up, negative feelings that you have. What do you mean? Yes, like almost like, hey, if you don't go out and share with a certain number of people, you're not a good Christian and God doesn't love you. Let me tell you something. There is nothing you can do to make God love you anymore. And there is nothing you can do to make God love you any less. You are unconditionally, absolutely loved in Christ. Now, that being said, I'll tell you how to experience joy in Christ is follow him in these things. Then you'll start to experience the joy of walking with Christ and being in mission with him. But yes, okay, legalism, thank you. What other negative feelings do you have? Fear of rejection, big, right? Yes, I feel like it's going to be awkward and it's going to be unnatural. Yeah, that's a big fear. Yep. What else is a fear? Hostility, yeah, that they're gonna be hostile towards you, or it might ruin your reputation. All of these fears, there's lots of fears. How about this fear? I'm afraid. What if they ask me a question I don't know the answer? I'm going to give you the perfect answer. If someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, this is the perfect answer. There's no better answer. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. Let me think about that. Or if you want to, I can get back to you, but I don't know. That's okay. It's all part of just being genuine and being real and not feeling, but that fear of what if I don't know the answer stops us so much. Do you know what I mean? Okay, any other fears that come out with the word evangelism? People are indifferent, which means, and why is that? Tell me, unpack that fear a little bit. That they'll think you're a weirdo?
A little bit, and that it's just not important to them. I'm spiritual, but I have no interest in your church or a Bible study or talking about anything spiritual, so leave me alone.
Yes, yes. And, rejection and indifference, and sometimes indifference is even worse than rejection, where you just kind of walk away and you're just like, yeah, no, I hear you. So that it's this fear of response. It's interesting because I think we fear negative response, and sometimes we even fear positive response. Like, what if they're interested, but I don't know what to do next? And what do I do with them? Like, do I invite them to church? Do I try to do a Bible study with them? Like, what do I do? So there's this fear of positive response sometimes. It's interesting that Jesus actually addresses this fear. I think it's in Luke 12:10 or 11. He says, do not worry if you are questioned in front of synagogues or governors or rulers. Do not worry about what you will say. The Holy Spirit will give it to you at the time. So I think it's interesting that Jesus is addressing some of the fear that we have, and he says, which doesn't sound extremely comforting unless we really believe that the Holy Spirit, but he says, don't worry about it. Why are you worrying? Don't worry about how people will respond. Let me deal with that. Don't worry about it. So that's some of the fears that we have is about worrying about response. Good. Okay. We're going to move on. What we do know, and I hope that this goes deeper and deeper inside of us, is that not only are we directly called in Scripture to be witnesses, but we see themes all through Scripture that communicate how God uses us as witnesses and how God uses us to permeate and impact the people around us. So I'll just list these out very quickly. Matthew 4. It's the idea of being a fisherman. You know, Jesus comes to Peter and says, you're no longer going to catch fish, but now you're going to be a fisher of men. So it's this idea of that we are called to go out. We already saw the Great Commission where we are to make disciples. We are all to be disciple makers. Matthew 5:13 and 14, we see that we are called salt. We see that we are called light. Okay? 2 Corinthians 2:15, am I going too quickly? In 2 Corinthians 2:15, it says that we are aroma. I love how it uses these different, so far we've seen taste, smell, sight. So it's this idea of that our presence permeates the environment where we are. It permeates our community. It permeates our workplace. It permeates our friends, our family. You know, but that's our presence does this. Luke 8, we get this picture of the farmer who is sowing seed. And that's what we're called to do, is sow seed. And we're going to talk about what that seed is. Just one quick story, just in terms of permeating our workplace. For about 8 years before we went into full-time ministry, I was working in HR, kind of like a residential coordinator of a head trauma rehabilitation center in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. And I used to work with this woman named Joanne, and Joanne, I would call her an evangelistic atheist, okay? Which she was an atheist, but she just wasn't passive. She was evangelistic about it. Like she was constantly promoting, oh, there's no God, that's ridiculous, and so forth. And our offices were right next to each other. And I worked next to Joanne for years, okay? And she would, Joanne would come in and she'd see me over and she'd say, oh, how was your weekend? Did you have any wild prayer parties this weekend? Or I'd walk up and Joanne would be like, oh, everybody watch your language, Kevin's coming. And, she was just constantly mocking and constantly joking and making comments. And some of it was, she's actually pretty funny. So some of it was actually pretty funny at my expense. And I actually would just laugh, but some of it was just annoying and wearisome. But this went on year after year after year after year for about 3 years. And then one day, Joanne comes into work. She comes into work, walks down through the hallway, walks past her office and comes to mine, knocks on the door, doesn't wait for me to say, come in. She comes in and she sits down and she says this: can you pray for my mother? I just found out last night she had cancer and I don't know what to do. She starts crying. Oh my gosh. Year after year after year, I'm like, oh, I should just avoid this woman and not say anything that's going to provoke more aggression from her. But you know who the first person she went to was? She came to me. And I actually consider that a great honor. And I'm thankful for that. Do you know what I mean? But there was a cost to pay for a number of years. I didn't know if it would ever happen, and you know what I mean? So I just want to encourage you that you will get responses. You will get responses. Some of them negative, some of them positive, but it's encouraging if you do not give up, if you are faithful. Some of those negatives become positives. Some of those negatives change. So Okay, so the challenge in the next page, the top of the next page, man, I have to really watch my time here. Okay, we are really behind. How do we get into spiritual conversations? We know we want to share that Jesus died for us, that he rose, he died on the cross for our sins, he rose from the. We know we want to share these ideas, that he paid the punishment for our sin, that we can receive forgiveness. We want to share this good news, but how do we get there? And this is why I want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now, this passage, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that this is the most important passage in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, when it comes to, let me just say that. I'll just not qualify it. This is the most important passage in the whole Hebrew Bible, in the whole Old Testament. You say, well, why do you say that? Well, this passage, if you talk to an Orthodox Jew or a Hasidic Jew, they pray this passage every single day. This passage, it's such a significant passage that it's rolled up in a scroll, and Jewish men will tie it to their arms, and every day they will pray this passage. They will take this passage and put it, and it's in a scroll, and they will put it on a box on their forehead and pray this prayer every single day. This prayer is so important, and this passage is so important that any Jewish home that you walk into, you will see a little box on the side of their door, and in that box is a little scroll with this passage on it. And you say, Kevin, how can you say it's the most important passage in the Old Testament? Well, some of the Jews came to Jesus and said, what is the most important commandment in all of the law? And you know what Jesus said? This passage. He quoted this. And then he said, the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So, just for the sake of time, I'm going to read this passage out loud, and we're just going to make some observations. You're going to call them out, and I'm going to repeat them so that we can get them on the audio. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Okay, so what are some big ideas that we see from this passage? We'll just take 3 or 4. Just yell it out and I'll repeat it. Okay, living them out in all circumstances. And where do you see that?
On your gates, when you lie down, when you get up.
Excellent, excellent. Yep. Anybody, other ideas? A couple more. Love God totally. Good. What else? Impress them on your children. Okay, good. All right, so let's just stop there. So here we have this passage that we are to love God with all of our heart and with all of our soul and with all of our strength. We're to love God with everything we are. But the cool thing I like about this passage is then it goes on to tell us what that looks like. What does it look like to love God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength? And this is what it looks like. You talk about Him. You talk about Him when you get up in the morning. You talk about Him when you're walking out along the road. You're on your way to work. You talk about Him at work. You talk about Him when you come home at night. You talk about Him when you lie down at night. Basically, the picture it's giving is the way to love God with all of our heart and soul and strength is to talk about Him from the very moment we wake up to all the moments in between. And to the very time we go to bed is that we're talking about the Lord. That's how we love God, okay? This passage for Jewish people is called the Shema. And the reason is the Hebrew word for that very first word there, hear, is the word Shema. And it's all through the Old Testament, Shema. It means hear and obey, okay? So this is the Shema. S-H-E-M-A. we've taken that word, and in our ministry, the training that we do, we call, this is not a biblical thing, this is just a thing that we made up. Anything that you say that lets people know that you love God or that you are a spiritual person, we just call that a Shema statement. A Shema statement. Okay? Now, let's just look at a few more things from this text. Let's look at, it says, tie them as symbols on your hands. Okay? These commands of God. It says, tie them, this Shema, tie them as symbols on your hands. This is why Orthodox and Hasidic Jews strap leather around their arms. They're literally doing this. Who sees it if you tie it on your hand? Or if you have this truth of God in your hand? Who sees it? Others, it's a reminder to yourself. But then it says, bind it to your forehead. Who sees it if it's bound to your forehead? Everybody sees it. You can't interact with anybody without them seeing that you are a person of God. Okay? I used to have an acne problem, and sometimes I would get these huge pimples, and I was just so self-conscious that everybody could see that they could. It's just a matter of, are they going to say something or not? But it's so obvious that, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? How's your family? You know what I mean? Like, it's so obvious that the person can't not see it. You know what I mean? And that's what it... Now, we don't actually wear boxes on our head, but when it says to talk about God all the time, I think what we can say is that your conversation, from the moment they have a conversation with you, it's so obvious through your speech that they can't not see that you are a spiritual person, that you love the Lord. Now, let me make a quick clarification. This does not mean, a Shema statement does not mean that you shared the gospel. All it means is that you indicated that you are a spiritual person. And when a person is spiritually receptive and they see that you are a spiritual person, they will respond in a certain way. Or if they are angry at spiritual people, or if they think that's ridiculous, they'll respond in a certain way. Or they just won't respond at all because they don't care. Okay? And all three happen all the time. And one of the things that we do in our training is we try to get people to turn up their spiritual volume and let their spirituality come out through their language. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement, and I would stand by this 1,000 times. This is what we've seen through the last 15 years of lots of people on lots of teams. The people who live out their faiths, whose language, in their language, the people whose volumes are the loudest, lead the most people to Jesus, period. The people whose volume is the lowest lead the least people to Jesus, period. So we train people on how to turn up their spiritual volume and allow their spirituality to come out in their everyday language. Okay? One last thing from this passage. Tie them, put it on the door frames of your houses. Who sees it if it's on the door frame of your house? You do when you go in and out. Anybody who comes into your house. Who sees it if it's on your gates? Everybody in the community. Okay? So we're getting this picture of being so obvious to everybody around that you are a spiritual person. Now, this does not mean being obnoxious. It just means being very open, and it also means you becoming comfortable in your own spiritual skin. Let me share, just tracking my time here. Let me share a couple stories. So I realized something about my personality. So ever since, in high school, I was actually doing a little bit more naturally, and then I went to some evangelism trainings, and these evangelism trainings kind of messed me up a bit because now I had like an agenda that I had to follow in my conversation, and that messed me up, right? And so, but I would still go out and I would do a lot of evangelism, but I would plan it in my schedule. Oh, I'm going to go out with Joe from 2 to 4, and we're going to go out to the park and do that, right? And let me just say, God uses that too. But it's that when you do that wipes. What about the rest of the 98% of your schedule? You know what I mean? What about that? What about that? So it messed me up. And what I found that is I would go out and do evangelism, but I was not living out loud just throughout the day with regular people that I would meet along the way. And so some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I don't know, maybe 15, I don't know. God was convicting me. Kevin, you need to slow down, engage people, and live out loud. So he was convicting me of this, so I go to the gym one day, Planet Fitness on 125th Street, and I say, okay, I'm going to slow down and actually talk to people, along the way. So I'm leaving, and it was wintertime, and I figured, I'll just go down to the front, and I'll put my sweats on there. So I go down to the front, and I'm planning to just try to be the spiritual person that I am. And I say to the woman behind the counter, I said, oh, hey, how you doing? And she says, I'm great. I was like, wow, really, why? She said, I found my phone. I was like, oh, you lost it? She goes, yeah, I lost it for a bunch of days, and I found it. Okay, so she made this statement, and now, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, now, Kevin, make a spiritual statement. And so I start going through the Rolodex of spiritual statements that I could make. I mean, I could have just simply said, oh, praise the Lord. But I'm not really a praise the Lord type of person. Like that phrase, that doesn't really fit me. I could have said a bunch of, but this is what I said. I'm not saying this is good. This is just what came to mind at the time. So she said, I found my phone, and I said, oh, wow, you should call your friends together to celebrate. And you're like, that's not a spiritual state. And she totally had no idea what I was talking about, and she totally ignored it. And then she goes on and says, yeah, it was actually down inside the recliner, and blah, 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 and it was 3 days later, blah, blah, blah. And I said this, I said, actually, it's funny, there's this story in the Bible where someone loses something, and they find it, so they call all their friends together to celebrate. And actually, it's a story about someone who's far away from God, that when they come back, all the angels celebrate. That's what I said. This is her response. She says, really? She said, I've never in my life been to church, and I've never read the Bible. And then she says this, but for some reason, about 3 weeks ago, I decided to buy a Bible. I said, really? I said, do you think you want to learn about the Bible and God? She's like, I bought one. I was like, all right. Now, I used to think if I don't engage this person, okay, this person will die and go to hell forever. Now, I believe in hell, but I don't exactly think that anymore. I'll tell you what I think now. If I don't engage this person, then God will use one of his faithful children to engage this person. And I will forever sit on the sideline thinking, why is it that that person has so many spiritual conversations and leads so many people to the Lord, and I don't see anything? And it's all about just seeking to turn up our volumes spiritually. Okay, just turn up our volumes. And I think a lot of the fear that we have is self-projected. We are so afraid. I mean, we listed all the different things that we're afraid of, but we're afraid to be awkward. We're afraid of an awkward situation, right? And it cripples us. It cripples us. And part of this is becoming comfortable in your own spiritual skin so that that fear is gone. But let me tell you this, that this workshop and that book is not going to make it happen automatically. It's something you need to grow in over. It's like changing your diet and your habit. And you take small steps of turning up the volume. Okay? But a lot of the fear we have is self-projected. And because we are afraid to be awkward, then when we start engaging someone spiritually, you know what? We feel awkward, and you know how they feel? Awkward. But if we don't feel awkward, they won't feel awkward. Like, for instance, I talk to people in New York and all the time, and they live out their spirituality, and they don't feel awkward, and I don't feel awkward. Oh, how you doing? I'm so angry at that person for doing that, but karma is gonna get them. They didn't feel awkward about saying that. I didn't feel awkward when they said it, and the conversation just moved on. Or, my wife and I are getting a divorce. I just think the universe is taking us in different directions. They're revealing their worldview. They're revealing their spiritual beliefs. They don't feel awkward saying it. I didn't feel awkward when they said it. But for some reason with Christians, when we reveal our spiritual beliefs, we feel awkward. You know who doesn't feel awkward about talking about spiritual things? Muslims. They don't feel awkward. Inshallah, God willing, the Lord, they talk about it all the time. Do you know who does feel awkward? Christians. Why is that? And I think we have allowed the culture so much to shape us in terms of this fear, and we need to break that in our hearts. Let me share a story with you. There is a woman, in our house church network. I'm a part of a house church network. We have a bunch of different house churches. Anyway, Sue lives in a place, and she has small kids. And next to her is a Bangladeshi woman who also has small kids, and they do play dates together, the kids and the mothers, right? So Sue comes to us and says, please pray for me. I want to engage my neighbor. Happened yet. And then after a month, still didn't, then 2 months, then 3 months. And she was just agonizing over not being able to engage her spiritually. And then one day, Sue calls her neighbor and says, do you guys want to, or text, I don't know how it was, but calls her neighbor and says, hey, do you guys want to come over and play, like a play date? And the woman's like, yes, very strongly. And about an hour later, the woman knocks at the door alone. And Sue's confused, and she says, I'm here to pray. English was not her first language. Sue said, do you want to come over and play? And she heard, do you want to come over and pray? And within an hour, I'm here to pray. Now, what do we learn from that? I think there's two things. One, I think they're both true. One, God is so good and so gracious that he knew Sue's heart and he divinely orchestrated a language misunderstanding to build this bridge. I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you the other interpretation. I got to do that one over here. All this time, Sue is agonizing over how can I engage my neighbor spiritually. And all she had to do was say, hey, do you want to pray? And the woman's like, yes, I want to pray. Sue put so much fear on herself of how this person is going to respond that it crippled her. And we do the same thing. I gave a message about this at a church, and I'm in Pennsylvania, and I'm driving home back to New York. It was a 3-hour drive, and the pastor calls me about an hour and a half in. He says, Kev, guess what happened? I said, what? He said, a guy in our church named Bill heard your sermon, and he went home, and he was really convicted that he's going to turn up his spiritual volume. So he pulls into his driveway, and he sees his neighbor Joe out in the yard. They didn't have a fence. It was between their houses. And Joe was picking up branches from within their yards, between their two yards. So Bill goes out to Joe and says, hey, Joe, what are you doing? He says, I'm just picking up branches and so forth. And then Bill's thinking, how can I engage him spiritually? And the thing that he could think of, he just said this. He said, Joe, is there anything I can pray for you about? That's all he said. And at first, Joe was like, no, everything's fine. And then Bill's like, are you sure? And then Joe says, well, actually, things aren't going well in our marriage. I get emotional every time I think of this story. He says, things aren't going well in our marriage. You can pray for that. And, my 2 kids aren't talking to me anymore. And everything is just not going well. He said that Joe starts sobbing in the backyard. And he is able to pray healing over Joe and his marriage and relationship with his children. And then he couldn't believe it, so he comes back into the house. He calls his pastor. He says, guess what happens? And he tells him this story, and then he says this. He says, I can't believe it that I lived next to Joe for 10 years, and this is the first time I ever engaged him spiritually. It's just fear that is holding us back. And so really this book is about how to turn up our volume, how to get over that fear, how to not be controlled by this cultural narrative that's trying to shut your mouth. That you can feel comfortable in your own spiritual skin. And actually, to be honest with you, most people aren't even going to care. They're not going to think you're weird. Okay? How do I know that we feel uncomfortable in our own spiritual skin? One way that you know it is because you have 2 different sets of language. You have one set of language that you use with your believing friends, and you have another set of language that you use with your unbelieving friends or at work. Like, oh yeah, we're really thinking about, whatever. Like, we're thinking about moving and we're just really praying about it. This is how you talk at church. We're really praying about it and just seeking what the Lord has for this, and we believe that he's going to guide us. You don't say that with your unbelieving friends. With your unbelieving friends, you just say, yeah, we're thinking about moving. We're just trying to look through the pros and cons. You know what I mean? That's 2 different sets of language. And as you feel comfortable in your own spiritual skin, you'll just have that one set of language. You just say, hey, I'm really praying about this. I'm thinking, we're just asking God what he wants us to do, and we're trying to oh, really? So you pray about this? Like, how else are people going to... Look, I really believe that what Jesus says in Luke chapter 10 about the harvest being plentiful, I believe that's true today. The harvest is plentiful. There are thousands of people all around. They are not going to come into the church, but it doesn't mean they're not spiritually thirsty and hungry. And the way that we find out who is spiritually receptive is we turn up our volume, and they respond. If they respond positively, then you engage them about it. If they respond negatively, you don't have to push the gospel down their throat. If they're indifferent, you don't have to push anything on them either. But you will find lots of people who respond positively. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I have 10 minutes. All right, I'm going to try to leave some time for questions. But let me share one more story, because I do want to say this. I want to tell you this now so that you don't get discouraged. I want to encourage you to begin to take steps of turning up your spiritual volume, okay? In the beginning, everything inside of you is going to feel nervous and anxious about doing that, and you got to break through that, right? And in the beginning, sometimes you say awkward things, but it's okay. You know what I mean? Like, let me share one quick story. I have this eye condition. It's like a deteriorating eye condition. So every 6 months or so, I go to the doctors, and they take pictures of my eyes to see how much they've deteriorated, right? So they have this kind of machine or some kind of thing that holds my eyes open, and then I go behind some kind of camera thing, and I sit there, and they take pictures, right? So I go in, and there's this new clinician that is there, and she sets me all up, and I'm sitting down, and she's doing a lot of stuff, so it's just silent. So I'm just kind of thinking, what kind of Shema statement can I make? This is what I'm thinking, like this. I'm just sitting like this. And I just said what came to my mind, I'm not saying this is good. It actually wasn't. I just said, so, my eye condition, do you think that's because of my sin or the sin of my parents? Oh, brother. I'm not kidding you. I think it was like 4 days before she responded. It was so long. It was so much awkward silence. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so awkward. And this is her response. So I said to her, so my eye condition, do you think this is because of my sin or the sin of my parents? Long silence. And then she says, you'll have to ask the doctor. I guess she wasn't licensed to give prognosis like that, you know what I mean? And I left there thinking, oh, awkward. But you know what? I've never seen her again. I'm okay. I'm not that, you know what I mean? So maybe you'll say some dumb things along the way. Who knows? But it doesn't matter. You will become more and more comfortable. And I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute, but let me just say this. And then I actually have to explain the homework. But when you first meet somebody, you need to let them know that you are a spiritual person from conversation number one. You got to do it from conversation number one. If you don't do it in conversation number one, conversation number two is twice as hard to bring it up later. If you don't do it in the first two, third conversation is like 5 times harder. Fourth conversation, you'll probably never do it, and you'll be in the situation of Sue, who is just kind of like agonizing, how do I cross this bridge? So it's just about becoming, what I talk about here is not about a strategy of evangelism. It's basically just becoming the genuine person as light and aroma and salt that God calls you to be, and to become comfortable in that. And as we become, you see, what we've been doing for a long time is we've been taking our light and putting it under a bowl. And all I'm trying to say is, hey, we have to just take it off and use the language that we use at church everywhere else. One last thing I'm going to say, then we're going to questions. If you're spending time in the Word in the mornings every day, if you're spending time in prayer, not only do you go out in power, and God actually orchestrates divine appointments. And when I say divine appointments, the woman at Planet Fitness, that was a divine appointment. God had been working in her for the last 2 months. She bought a Bible 3 weeks ago. God had been working in me to share, and he brought us together. When we are willing to live out loud, God will orchestrate divine appointments to bring people to you. But take some steps along the way. Try to grow in it. It's really helpful if you grow with other people in it. So I know some people are going to be using this book in their small groups, and that's a great thing to just say, hey, did you have any experiences this week trying to live out loud, and how did people respond? And I'll tell you, I used to do those groups in the past, and I would learn a lot from people who would go out and make Shema statements. But try to do it from the very beginning. Be genuine, be honest. Don't try to make it sound like your spiritual life is all perfect. Just be completely honest. If you feel like you're distant from the Lord, say it. If you feel like you're, whatever, just say what you feel. Be honest. Don't wait. In the book, there's a section about the problem with friendship evangelism. Friendship, I'm all for friendship, I'm all for evangelism, but friendship evangelism that's become quite common is this idea that you need to earn the right to talk to someone spiritually, and you earn that through building trust. And I think that's completely unbiblical. You don't need to earn the right to be who God called you to be and to just live out loud, to be yourself. If people want to be your friends, they'll be your friend. But you don't need to earn the right to be genuine. Okay? It's bait and switch if you hide who you are until they trust you, and then you pull it out. Like, oh, now that I'm going to hook you. And they could legitimately say, oh, if Jesus is the most important thing in your life, like you say, how come I haven't heard about it for months? That would be a legitimate question. So, all right, let's see. Let's go over. This bottom part here is for you to just fill that out later on your own. That can be part of your homework in terms of what are you wrestling with? What steps do you need to take? Here's some very simple homework, very simple. change the following statements into more Shema-like statements. So, if you were to make the statement, I'm thinking about a career change, how might you say that to believers? Or how could you say that to include God in that? Yeah. So this is what, and you might come up with a bunch of different ones. Some people say, oh, tell me what Shema statements to make. It's like, well, that's really hard because every Shema statement depends on the situation. Do you know what I mean? It's just about life. Someone comes into the elevator and say, oh, wow, God's really blessed you with some, beautiful children. Like I might say something like that. I was getting on what's it called? The shuttle from the airport to going somewhere. And the driver of the shuttle, the woman was running and she said, oh, I got caught up and then I just got here just in time. And the airport shuttle guy said, man, it's amazing how God does things like that to bless us. And I was like, wow, that's good. Like he's living out loud, casually, comfortably. He just said, wow, it's amazing how God does things like that. Like, so we want to try to change these statements into statements that might express our spirituality, okay? And then I want you to write out some different Shema statements for other areas that you are in life, maybe with your neighbors or at work or something. What are some Shema type statements? And then in number 3 is write out how Luke 10:2, this is where it says the harvest is plentiful, should change the way you relate to people. Should change the way, because if we believe Luke 10:2, it changes everything in terms of our posture. The fact that we don't believe the harvest is plentiful, we go out in fear. If we do believe the harvest is plentiful, it changes our posture as we go out. So you can unpack that a little bit more. All right, let's see. We have 5 more minutes. Let's open up to questions. Oh, no, we don't have 5 minutes. We have 1 minute. Okay, let's open up to questions that you might have. Any questions or thoughts? I know we went through this very quickly. Yes.
What I've had very great success with is saying when I'm in the area.
Actually, let's start over with your mic here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I often will say, "Oh, I go to the chapel, the Jacksonville Chapel," and when you mention that, everybody knows about the chapel, and they always say, "I've heard good things about it. I've gone to this, that, and the other things." So sometimes that's just a great opening statement.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful opening statement. Oh, yeah, what do you do this weekend? Well, I go to the chapel, and they're like, oh, yeah, I've heard about that. And then you can say, man, it's amazing how God is doing some really cool things in people's lives. We see people's lives changing all the time, and the stories are incredible. And you know what they might say? If they're spiritual interested, they might be like, really? Like, what do you mean? Oh, well, there was this woman just last week, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, great. Thank you, brother. Another comment. Comment or question?
Kevin, so if there is spiritual openness, what usually is your next step?
Okay, so if there is spiritual openness, there's also a variety of levels of spiritual openness too. But it depends. So sometimes there's spiritual openness, but they're not like ready to say, oh, I want to learn from the Bible. They might just be somewhat open. So I might go in and then from there, I'll just say, oh, so that's really interesting. So have you had experiences with God in the past? Let's just say I say that to them, and they're like, well, not really. And then you might share your testimony. I think what happened with me is when I was 32, I went through a period of real searching for, I'm just making this up right now, purpose in my life, and then you share your testimony. So what we do is in our ministry, we call it a ministry tool belt. And in the tool belt, obviously our Shema statements, we just feel comfortable. But then we have testimonies. And your testimonies are not just your salvation testimony of how you came to Christ. Your testimony is also another testimony of, yeah, we were really struggling financially, and I was really questioning whether God actually loved me, and then this happened, and I realized, and that's a testimony. Or, my wife had cancer, or my son was in a car accident, and I was praying out, and that's a testimony of God. So it's valuable to have different testimonies. And you might say, oh, they'll come to me naturally. Actually, they don't really come to you naturally, and communicating them actually doesn't come naturally. So in our groups, we actually practice them. We say, hey, what are the significant things that you've seen God do in your life? And what are those testimonies? Why don't you share that with us? That's confusing, John. You know, maybe you can leave out all those unnecessary details of blah, 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 and just share it. So we help people with their testimonies. What's another thing? Oh, that's so interesting that you shared that. You know, there's this story. This is another idea of how there's this story in the Bible about this father who had two sons. And one of the sons went off and he used all of his family's money and blah, blah, blah. And so another tool in our tool belt is it's valuable to have 3 to 5 Bible stories that you're familiar with enough where you could actually communicate them back. So we practice that kind of thing. What I don't want to do right now is for you to think, oh, I can't do this unless I have these other things. No. I'll tell you what to do. If you start now, and if someone's spiritually interested, this is the first thing you can say, hey, well, the easiest thing you can say is, hey, well, if you're interested, like, why don't you come this week to the chapel with me? That's the first thing you can say. If nothing else comes, say that. One of the things that I say is, hey, are you interested in learning more about the Bible? Why don't you gather some friends together and we'll start a Bible study? And this is a Bible study where there's no teacher. We just look at the text so anybody can lead it. We call them Discovery Bible Study. So that's another tool. So if they're very interested, I might invite them to start a Bible study. And we've seen hundreds of those Bible studies start. If they're not extremely interested, but they're interested in at least dialoguing, I might share my testimony, or I might share a Bible story, or I might say, hey, you know, can I pray? Well, let me say this real quickly. This is going to sound really bad, but there's something incredible about the fall that's helpful. Anybody who you engage has been impacted by it and is experiencing suffering. It's interesting in Luke chapter 10 that Jesus says, heal those who are sick. And I'm not even talking about going and having the gift of healing. I'm not making a theological statement. But anytime I engage someone, I ask them, oh, tell me about your mother or father. How's your brother? Hey, how's the health of your family? Are your children good? Are your parents good? You ask that question, you can always find people who have sickness in their family, right? Don't we all? That's a great opportunity to say, oh, can I pray right now for your mother, for her surgery that's coming up, or for the cancer that she has? Almost everybody will accept prayer. So you can move people along spiritually by having some other things in mind, like a Bible story, like your testimony, like asking about sickness in their family so that you can pray for them and things like that. So, and I think the book doesn't go that deeply into that, but our website, internationalproject.org, can help with that as well.